dense fog hung low over the rural village as the rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against rooftops and forming shallow pools in the dirt paths. The only source of light came from an old gas lamp at the edge of the village square, its flickering flame casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and twist like spectral figures. Ravi, a young man with an insatiable curiosity, was returning home after visiting a friend in the neighboring village. Clutching an umbrella that barely held against the wind, he trudged through the muddy path. The rain muffled most sounds, but an occasional rustle in the surrounding woods made his heart race. Every now and then he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows. The locals often spoke of the haunted forest that bordered the village, warning travelers never to venture too close on nights like this. According to legend, a restless spirit wandered the woods, searching for something or someone it had lost. Ravi had always dismissed the tales as mere superstition, but tonight, under the oppressive darkness and with every creak and groan of the trees amplified by his anxiety, he wasn't so sure. As he reached the outskirts of the forest, a cold gust of wind extinguished his umbrella, leaving him drenched and vulnerable. The path ahead was barely visible, illuminated only by occasional flashes of lightning. Suddenly, he heard it, a faint, haunting wail that sent shivers down his spine. It was distant, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakably human. "Who's there?" Ravi called out, his voice trembling. No answer. The only reply was the sound of rain and the rustling of leaves. He quickened his pace, but the wailing grew louder, closer. His breath came in short gasps as he stumbled over roots and rocks, desperate to escape whatever was following him. Then he saw her. A pale figure stood under a gnarled tree, her white sari soaked and clinging to her frail form. Her face was obscured by long, matted hair, but her presence was undeniable. Ravi froze, unable to move or look away. The woman slowly raised her head, revealing hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight through him. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. Before Ravi could respond, she vanished, leaving only the echo of her plea hanging in the air. Terrified, Ravi sprinted the rest of the way home, slamming the door shut behind him. His grandmother, who had been waiting up for him, immediately noticed his pale complexion and trembling hands. "What happened, Ravi?" she asked, concern etched on her face. I saw her," he stammered. "The spirit from the forest. She asked for help." His grandmother's expression darkened. "You mustn't go near the forest again," she said firmly. "The spirit's sorrow is bound to that place, and those who try to help her never return." But Ravi couldn't shake the image of the woman or the desperation in her voice. That night, as the storm raged on, he lay awake, wondering if he had the courage to return to the forest and uncover the truth, or if he would succumb to the same fate as those before him. Here's a potential idea for a new story: The Silent Station. The story revolves around an abandoned train station at the edge of a sprawling city. Despite being closed for decades, locals whisper about the phantom train that occasionally pulls into the station on moonless nights, its eerie whistle echoing through the empty streets. Maya, a skeptical journalist, sets out to uncover the truth behind the urban legend. Armed with her camera and recorder, she spends a night at the station, only to discover it isn't just a harmless ghost story. The station holds a portal to another realm, and the passengers boarding the spectral train are not entirely human or alive. As she delves deeper, Maya is faced with a chilling choice: expose the truth and risk becoming part of the legend, or flee and leave the dark secret undisturbed. Would you like me to develop this story further or create a different one? A dense fog hung low over the rural village as the rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against rooftops and forming shallow pools in the dirt paths. The only source of light came from an old gas lamp at the edge of the village square, its flickering flame casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and twist like spectral figures. Ravi, a young man with an insatiable curiosity, was returning home after visiting a friend in the neighboring village. Clutching an umbrella that barely held against the wind, he trudged through the muddy path. The rain muffled most sounds, but an occasional rustle in the surrounding woods made his heart race. Every now and then, he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows. The locals often spoke of the haunted forest that bordered the village, warning travelers never to venture too close on nights like this. According to legend, a restless spirit wandered the woods, searching for something or someone it had lost. Ravi had always dismissed the tales as mere superstition, but tonight, under the oppressive darkness and with every creak and groan of the trees amplified by his anxiety, he wasn't so sure. As he reached the outskirts of the forest, a cold gust of wind extinguished his umbrella, leaving him drenched and vulnerable. The path ahead was barely visible, illuminated only by occasional flashes of lightning. Suddenly, he heard it, a faint, haunting wail that sent shivers down his spine. It was distant, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakably human. "Who's there?" Ravi called out, his voice trembling. No answer. The only reply was the sound of rain and the rustling of leaves. He quickened his pace, but the wailing grew louder, closer. His breath came in short gasps as he stumbled over roots and rocks, desperate to escape whatever was following him. Then he saw her. A pale figure stood under a gnarled tree, her white sari soaked and clinging to her frail form. Her face was obscured by long, matted hair, but her presence was undeniable. Ravi froze, unable to move or look away. The woman slowly raised her head, revealing hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight through him. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. Before Ravi could respond, she vanished, leaving only the echo of her plea hanging in the air. Terrified, Ravi sprinted the rest of the way home, slamming the door shut behind him. His grandmother, who had been waiting up for him, immediately noticed his pale complexion and trembling hands. "What happened, Ravi?" she asked, concern etched on her face. I saw her," he stammered. "The spirit from the forest. She asked for help." His grandmother's expression darkened. "You mustn't go near the forest again," she said firmly. "The spirit's sorrow is bound to that place, and those who tried to help her never returned." But Ravi couldn't shake the image of the woman or the desperation in her voice. That night, as the storm raged on, he lay awake, wondering if he had the courage to return to the forest and uncover the truth, or if he would succumb to the same fate as those before him. Days passed, but Ravi couldn't stop thinking about the woman. Every time he closed his eyes, her hollow gaze haunted him. Desperate for answers, he approached the village elder, a frail man named Hari, who was known to hold the stories and secrets of the town. "You saw her, didn't you?" Hari said knowingly, when Ravi hesitated to speak. Ravi nodded. "I couldn't help her. She just disappeared. What does she want?" Hari sighed deeply, his hands trembling as he gestured for Ravi to sit. "The spirit is of a woman named Mira, who lived here many years ago. She was betrayed by someone she trusted, her own family. They accused her of witchcraft to cover their own sins, and the villagers turned on her. On a stormy night, much like the one you experienced, she fled into the forest, where she vanished. Some say her grief was so immense that it bound her soul to the land." "But why does she still linger?" Ravi pressed. "Perhaps she seeks justice, or someone brave enough to uncover the truth," Hari said. "But beware, young man. Many have tried to help her, and none have returned." Ravi's resolve only grew stronger. Later that evening, while rummaging through old belongings in his late grandfather's chest, he found something intriguing. A leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The handwriting was faded, but Ravi recognized the name scrawled on the first page. Mira. The journal detailed Mira's life in the village, her love for a man named Arun, and the betrayal she suffered at the hands of those closest to her. The final entry was written on the night of the storm, a frantic plea for someone to hear her story and set her spirit free. As Ravi read, the storm outside began to brew once more. The rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a mournful cry. He knew what he had to do: return to the forest and confront whatever lay within. Armed with the journal and a lantern, Ravi ventured into the forest as the storm raged around him. The air was thick with tension, and every step felt heavier than the last. The journal's final entry spoke of an ancient tree at the heart of the woods, a place where Mira believed she could find peace. As Ravi pushed deeper into the forest, the wailing began again, louder and more desperate than before. Shadows danced in the corners of his vision, and the lantern flickered as if struggling to stay lit. When he finally reached the ancient tree, its gnarled branches loomed like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. He placed the journal at the base of the tree and whispered, "Mira, I've come to help you. Tell me what you need." The wind stilled, and for a moment, the forest was eerily silent. Then she appeared. Mira's ghostly form emerged from the shadows, her eyes no longer hollow, but filled with sorrow. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "You've brought me what I needed most, the truth." The ground beneath the tree began to glow faintly, and Mira's form dissolved into the light. Ravi watched in awe as the oppressive darkness lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. But as he turned to leave, he heard one last whisper. "Beware, Ravi. The forest remembers those who tread its paths." Ravi returned to the village a changed man, his encounter with Mira forever etched into his soul. The forest, once a place of fear, now held a quiet stillness, as though her spirit had finally found rest. But the villagers knew better than to let their guard down, for in the heart of every legend lies a kernel of truth, and the forest's secrets were far from fully uncovered. Here's a new concept for a bigger full-length ghost story. Title: The Forgotten Asylum. Premise: in the heart of a sprawling city, Hidden within a decrepit industrial district stands St. Gabriel's Asylum, a place long abandoned, its history erased from official records. Once a sanctuary for the mentally ill, it was shut down abruptly after a string of unexplained deaths. For decades, the asylum remained sealed off, shrouded in mystery, until urban explorers began sneaking in, lured by tales of strange noises, shadowy figures, and cryptic messages scrawled on the walls. Enter Evelyn Carter, a documentary filmmaker struggling to make her breakthrough. Determined to expose the asylum's secrets, she assembles a small crew of skeptics, believers, and thrill seekers to investigate. But as they delve deeper into the asylum's decaying halls, they realize they're not alone. The team encounters malevolent spirits, shadowy apparitions, and relics of horrific experiments conducted under the guise of treatment. The group unravels the asylum's dark past, a cruel director who used occult rituals in the name of curing patients, inadvertently unleashing forces beyond his control. As Evelyn and her team uncover the asylum's secrets, they find themselves drawn into a sinister game orchestrated by these forces. Their only hope of escape lies in understanding the asylum's most enigmatic patient, a girl known only as Clara, whose ghost seems to guide them, though her motives remain unclear. Title: Shadows of the Pyre. Premise: in a remote village by the river, an ancient cremation ground known as Kali Kund has long been a source of unease. While its sacred pyres burn day and night, the villagers warn against staying near it after dark. Legends tell of restless spirits rising from the ash, seeking vengeance or peace. Ajay, a skeptic from the city, returns to the village after his father's death, tasked with performing the last rites. AJ dismisses the warnings as mere superstition, but during the rituals, he hears whispers in the wind, sees shadows moving against the flames, and feels an invisible presence watching him. When an old priest tells him his father's spirit may not have moved on, AJ is drawn into the cremation ground's sinister mysteries. The land hides a tragic history of betrayal, forbidden rituals, and vengeful spirits tied to the river's dark waters. As AJ uncovers long-buried secrets, he must confront the horrors of the past to save his family's legacy and his soul. The horror story of the cremation ground. The cremation ground, known locally as Agni Bhumi, lay on the outskirts of the small town of Parvatipur. It was a desolate, eerie place bordered by thick woods and a sluggish river. For centuries, the ground had served as the final resting place for the town's dead, but it was also whispered to be a place of restless spirits. Locals avoided it after dark, recounting stories of shadows moving on their own, and the haunting sound of footsteps crunching on ash when no one was there. Arun, a pragmatic young man who worked in the city, returned to Parvatipur after his uncle's sudden death. Bound by tradition, he was tasked with arranging the funeral rites. While Aaron didn't believe in ghosts, he couldn't shake off the unease that settled over him as he walked toward the cremation ground in the twilight, accompanied by the town's elderly priest, Pandit Bhaskar. The flames of the pyre burned brightly against the darkening sky. As the rites progressed, a chilling wind swept through, extinguishing one of the ceremonial lamps. Pandit Bhaskar's hands trembled as he relit it, muttering a prayer under his breath. "The spirits are watching," he whispered to Arun. "Stay close and don't look into the woods." Aaron dismissed the priest's words as superstition, but as the flames consumed the pyre, he felt an icy breath against the back of his neck and heard a faint, mournful cry carried on the wind. Turning quickly, he glimpsed a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was a woman, draped in white, her face obscured by shadows. Before he could say anything, she vanished into the darkness. Back at his family home, Aaron recounted the experience to his mother, who paled visibly. "You saw her," she said, her voice trembling. "The White Widow. She's been haunting the cremation ground for decades. Who is she?" Arun asked, his curiosity piqued. His mother hesitated, then relented. "They say she was a young bride named Kamini, who came to Parvatipur years ago. Her husband died in a tragic accident just days after their wedding. In her grief, she threw herself onto his funeral pyre and perished. But the villagers believe she was betrayed by her husband's family, who were responsible for his death. Her spirit never found peace, and she lingers near the pyres, waiting for justice." Despite his skepticism, Arun couldn't shake the memory of the figure by the woods. Determined to uncover the truth, he visited the village's oldest resident, Dadaji, who had witnessed Kamini's death firsthand. Dadaji's voice was barely audible as he recounted the events. "She wasn't just a bride, she was a fire, full of life. Her death was no accident. Kamini's husband discovered something about his family, something that cost him his life. Kamini's screams still echo in my mind." When Arun pressed for more details, Dadaji shook his head. "The cremation ground is cursed. If you value your life, stay away." Into the depths of Agni Bhumi Aruns, nights became restless, plagued by dreams of the White Widow's hollow eyes and outstretched hands. One stormy evening, driven by an unrelenting need for answers, he returned to the cremation ground. This rain poured in torrents, drenching the earth and extinguishing the faint glow of the pyres. Armed with a lantern and a prayer whispered by Pandit Bhaskar, Arun stepped into the heart of Agni Bhumi. The air was heavy, filled with the acrid smell of burned wood and something far more pungent: decay. He called out into the night, "Kamini, if you're here, show yourself." The wind howled and the flames of his lantern flickered. From the shadows emerged the spectral figure of the White Widow, her white sari stained with ash and her hair flowing like tendrils of smoke. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Help me," she pleaded. "How?" Arun asked, his voice trembling. "Find the truth," she said, before vanishing into the mist. At her feet lay a small, jarred wooden box. Inside, Arun discovered a bundle of old letters and a faded photograph of Kamini and her husband. The letters revealed a conspiracy. Kamini's in-laws had poisoned her husband to claim his inheritance. Kamini had uncovered the truth just before her death, a confrontation with the past. Determined to bring the White Widow's story to light, Arun shared the evidence with Pandit Bhaskar and the village elders. At first, they were reluctant to act, fearing the wrath of the spirits. But Arun's persistence paid off, and a meeting was held to address the dark history of Kamini's death. As the villagers gathered near the pyres, Arun recited the contents of the letters, exposing the family's treachery. The descendants of Kamini's in-laws present at the meeting denied the allegations until a sudden gust of wind extinguished the pyres. The White Widow appeared, her ghostly form towering above the crowd. "Justice," she intoned, her voice echoing like 1,000 screams. The guilty family members fell to their knees, confessing their ancestors' crimes in tears. Kamini's spirit began to glow with a warm, golden light. "Thank you," she whispered to Arun before dissolving into the night sky. The cremation ground of Agni Bhumi was never the same. While the stories of hauntings faded, the villagers treated the place with reverence. Arun returned to the city, forever changed by his encounter. The letters and photograph were enshrined in the village temple as a reminder of the cost of betrayal and the power of truth. But on stormy nights, some say the faint outline of a woman in white can still be seen by the pyres, watching, guarding, ensuring peace prevails in the land of the dead. The horror story of the cremation ground, the first encounter. The cremation ground, known locally as Agni Bhumi, lay on the outskirts of the small town of Parvatipur. It was a desolate, eerie place bordered by thick woods and a sluggish river. For centuries, the ground had served as the final resting place for the town's dead, but it was also whispered to be a place of restless spirits. Locals avoided it after dark, recounting stories of shadows moving on their own, and the haunting sound of footsteps crunching on ash when no one was there. Arun, a pragmatic young man who worked in the city, returned to Parvatipur after his uncle's sudden death. Bound by tradition, he was tasked with arranging the funeral rites. While Arun didn't believe in ghosts, he couldn't shake off the unease that settled over him as he walked toward the cremation ground in the twilight, accompanied by the town's elderly priest, Pandit Bhaskar. The flames of the pyre burned brightly against the darkening sky. As the rites progressed, a chilling wind swept through, extinguishing one of the ceremonial lamps. Pandit Bhaskar's hands trembled as he relit it, muttering a prayer under his breath. "The spirits are watching," he whispered to Arun. "Stay close and don't look into the woods." Arun dismissed the priest's words as superstition, but as the flames consumed the pyre, he felt an icy breath against the back of his neck and heard a faint, mournful cry carried on the wind. Turning quickly, he glimpsed a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was a woman, draped in white, her face obscured by shadows. Before he could say anything, she vanished into the darkness. The legend of the White Widow. Back at his family home, Arun recounted the experience to his mother, who paled visibly. "You saw her," she said, her voice trembling. "The White Widow. She's been haunting the cremation ground for decades. Who is she?" Arun asked, his curiosity piqued. His mother hesitated, then relented. "They say she was a young bride named Kamini, who came to Parvatipur years ago. Her husband died in a tragic accident just days after their wedding. In her grief, she threw herself onto his funeral pyre and perished. But the villagers believe she was betrayed by her husband's family, who were responsible for his death. Her spirit never found peace, and she lingers near the pyres, waiting for justice." Despite his skepticism, Arun couldn't shake the memory of the figure by the woods. Determined to uncover the truth, he visited the village's oldest resident, Dadaji, who had witnessed Kamini's death firsthand. Dadaji's voice was barely audible as he recounted the events. She wasn't just a bride, she was a fire, full of life. Her death was no accident. Kamini's husband discovered something about his family, something that cost him his life. Kamini's screams still echo in my mind. When Arun pressed for more details, Dadaji shook his head. The cremation ground is cursed. If you value your life, stay away. Into the depths of Agni Bhumi, Arun's nights became restless, plagued by dreams of the White Widow's hollow eyes and outstretched hands. One stormy evening, driven by an unrelenting need for answers, he returned to the cremation ground. The rain poured in torrents, drenching the earth and extinguishing the faint glow of the pyres. Armed with a lantern and a prayer whispered by Pandit Bhaskar, Arun stepped into the heart of Agni Bhumi. The air was heavy, filled with the acrid smell of burnt wood and something far more pungent, decay. He called out into the night, "Kamini, if you're here, show yourself." The wind howled, and the flames of his lantern flickered. From the shadows emerged the spectral figure of the White Widow, her white sari stained with ash, and her hair flowing like tendrils of smoke. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Help me," she pleaded. "How?" Arun asked, his voice trembling. "Find the truth," she said, before vanishing into the mist. At her feet lay a small jarred wooden box. Inside, Arun discovered a bundle of old letters and a faded photograph of Kamini and her husband. The letters revealed a conspiracy. Kamini's in-laws had poisoned her husband to claim his inheritance. Kamini had uncovered the truth just before her death. A confrontation with the past. Determined to bring the White Widow's story to light, Arun shared the evidence with Pandit Bhaskar and the village elders. At first, they were reluctant to act, fearing the wrath of the spirits. But Arun's persistence paid off, and a meeting was held to address the dark history of Kamini's death. As the villagers gathered near the pyres, Arun recited the contents of the letters, exposing the family's treachery. The descendants of Kamini's in-laws present at the meeting denied the allegations until a sudden gust of wind extinguished the pyres. The White Widow appeared, her ghostly form towering above the crowd. "Justice," she intoned, her voice echoing like 1,000 screams. The guilty family members fell to their knees, confessing their ancestors' crimes in tears. Kamini's spirit began to glow with a warm, golden light. "Thank you," she whispered to Arun before dissolving into the night sky. The rising shadows. Despite the resolution of Kamini's story, Arun's restlessness persisted. The villagers believed the curse was lifted, but Arun began to notice strange occurrences. One night, he woke to the sound of muffled cries outside his window. Peering into the darkness, he saw fleeting shadows moving toward Agni Bhumi. Pandit Bhaskar's demeanor changed as well. The priest confessed to Arun that Kamini's tale was just one of many. "This land is older than the village," he said. "Agni Bhumi is a crossroads for the living and the dead. Kamini's spirit might have found peace, but others are still waiting." Curiosity pushed Arun to investigate further. He began to uncover more hidden histories of the cremation ground. Stories of rituals gone wrong, forgotten graves, and spirits bound by unfinished business. Each discovery brought new visions and whispers in the night, as if the dead were calling out to him. The final Rider-Run sought out help from a renowned spiritual guide, Swami Rajan, who had studied ancient texts on restless spirits. The Swami revealed that Arun had become a beacon for the dead, unintentionally drawing them to him. To break the cycle, Arun would need to perform a grand ritual, a moksha yajna, to release all trapped spirits in Agni Bhumi. The ritual required Arun to gather sacred materials and chant ancient mantras at midnight under a new moon. With the help of Swami Rajan and Pandit Bhaskar, Arun prepared for the rite. On the fateful night as Arun chanted, the air grew heavy with a palpable energy. The spirits of the cremation ground appeared, their forms flickering like dying embers. The ritual climaxed as Arun placed Kamini's letters and photograph into the ceremonial fire. The flames roared, and a blinding light engulfed the cremation ground. When the light faded, a profound silence settled over the land. Peace restored. The next morning, the villagers found Arun sitting by the river, exhausted but at peace. Agni Bhumi felt different, lighter, almost serene. Arun left Parvatipur soon after, but the villagers never forgot his courage. Years later, the cremation ground became a place of pilgrimage, known not for its hauntings, but for its tranquility. Yet, some say that on the night of a new moon, the faint hum of Arun's chants can still be heard, a reminder of the man who bridged the worlds of the living and the dead. The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. True. Nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been, and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing, acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived it haunted me day and night. Object there was none, passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so, by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now, this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded. With what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it. Oh, so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, so that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Ah, would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously. Oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye, and this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning, when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him. calling him by name in a hearty tone, and inquiring how he had passed the night. So you see he would have been a very profound old man, indeed, to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. Watches my new dad moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. To think that there I was, opening the door little by little, and he, not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly, as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch, with the thick darkness, for the shutters were close fastened, through fear of robbers, and so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily. Steadily. I had my head in, and was about to open the lantern, when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in the bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed listening, just as I have done, night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh no, it was the low stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise, when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor," or "It is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found all in vain. All in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim, and it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a single dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot out from the crevice and fell full upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray as if by instinct, precisely upon the damned spot. And now, have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the senses? Now, I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury, as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker, and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous, so I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet, for some minutes longer I refrained and stood still, but the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst, and now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes, the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If still you think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. Then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught all. When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men, who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I made them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears, but still they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness until, at length, I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard? Not, Almighty God. No, they heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now, again, hark, louder, 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 louder. Villains, I shrieked, dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here. It is the beating of his hideous heart. The fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe during the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens. I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy House of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of that half-pleasurable, because poetic sentiment with which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate or terrible. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul, which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveler upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. There was an iciness, a sinking, a sickening of the heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought, which no goading of the imagination could torture into aught of the sublime. What was it? I paused to think. What was it that so unnerved me in the contemplation of the House of Usher? It was a mystery all insoluble, nor could I grapple with the shadowy fancies that crowded upon me as I pondered. I was forced to fall back upon the unsatisfactory conclusion that while beyond doubt there are combinations of very simple natural objects which have the power of thus affecting us, still the analysis of this power lies among considerations beyond our depth. It was possible, I reflected, that a mere different arrangement of the particulars of the scene, of the details of the picture, would be sufficient to modify, or perhaps to annihilate its capacity for sorrowful impression, and, acting upon this idea, I reined my horse to the precipitous brink of a black and lurid tarn that lay in unruffled luster by the dwelling, and gazed down, but with a shudder even more thrilling than before, upon the remodeled and inverted images of the gray sedge, and the ghastly tree stems, and the vacant and eye-like windows. Nevertheless, in this mansion of gloom, I now proposed to myself a sojourn of some weeks. Its proprietor, Roderick Usher, had been one of my boon companions in boyhood, but many years had elapsed since our last meeting. A letter, however, had lately reached me in a distant part of the country, a letter from him, which, in its wildly importunate nature, had admitted of no other than a personal reply. The MS gave evidence of nervous agitation. The writer spoke of acute bodily illness, of a mental disorder which oppressed him, and of an earnest desire to see me as his best, and indeed his only personal friend, with a view of attempting, by the cheerfulness of my society, some alleviation of his malady. It was the manner in which all this and much more was said. It was the apparent heart that went with his request, which allowed me no room for hesitation, and I accordingly obeyed forthwith what I still considered a very singular summons. The Black Cat, by Edgar Allan Poe. For the most wild yet most homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it, in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad am I not, and very surely do I not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I would unburden my soul. My immediate purpose is to explain away a matter which has been to me a most terrible experience. I'm about to tell the story of the most wild, most bizarre, and most terrifying events that ever befell me. I was not always a man of violent and wicked nature. On the contrary, in my youth, I was very fond of animals, and had been especially fond of a cat. It was a most beautiful animal, entirely black, and with a sleek, glossy coat. I had a strong affection for this animal, and it was the source of much enjoyment to me. My wife, too, loved it dearly, but the mood of my life changed. I began to drink heavily, and as the days passed, the spirits of anger and frustration began to take hold of me. The once gentle and kind man became irritable, moody, and unpredictable. I would often lash out at those around me, and in my fury, the animals, too, would bear the brunt of my wrath. One night, while intoxicated, I came home to find the cat, Pluto, seated serenely by the fireplace. In my fit of rage, I seized him by the throat and hung him from the branch of a tree. As I watched him die, I felt a surge of irrational satisfaction, and a wicked grin spread across my face. I had murdered the animal I had once loved, but this was not the end. The next day, a fire broke out in my house. I watched in horror as the building burned to the ground, and amidst the wreckage, I saw an image of Pluto's blackened form. Years passed, and my guilt continued to haunt me, but in time, I managed to silence the feelings of remorse and regret that had plagued my mind. I found a new cat, another black feline, which was a perfect doppelganger of Pluto. But this cat, while seemingly a replacement, also began to torment me in ways I could not explain. It had the same piercing yellow eyes as Pluto, and it seemed to watch me constantly, reminding me of my past cruelty. The cat began to drive me to madness. I would hear its cries and scratching sounds in the night, and I began to see it as a symbol of my own guilt and remorse. The more I struggled to rid myself of the cat, the more powerful it became. In the end, I could no longer stand the presence of the cat. In a fit of rage, I took an axe and struck it down, but my guilt had already consumed me, and as I murdered the cat, I realized that the horror I had created would never leave me. Shall I continue? The story builds to a chilling climax. The fall of the House of Usher. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day, in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone, on horseback, through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy House of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of that half-pleasurable, because poetic sentiment with which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate or terrible. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and the simple landscape features of the domain, and upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, and upon the dimly discernible, barely discernible, drooping of the trees upon the water's edge, their branches, however, rustling in the wind. And in the stillness of the evening, the sound seemed to amplify through the air, increasing the sense of dread and horror. From the first glance, I knew that this mansion, with its dilapidated, crumbling structure and the oppressive atmosphere around it, held deep secrets. The House of Usher was a place from which one could not escape. I had been invited by my friend, Roderick Usher, and I could not turn back. Upon entering, I was greeted by Roderick Usher, a friend of my youth, who I had not seen in years. His demeanor struck me as odd, disquieting even. He was pale, gaunt, and his eyes were unusually large. He appeared to be in a state of great mental distress. Roderick confessed to me that he had been suffering from a mysterious illness that affected both his body and mind. He also explained that his family was plagued by a hereditary condition, a condition that made his nerves incredibly sensitive and his mind prone to madness. As we spoke, Roderick revealed that his twin sister, Madeleine, was gravely ill. She had been bedridden for many days, and there seemed to be no cure for her mysterious ailment. Roderick seemed to be haunted by her condition and by the history of his family. The house itself seemed to reflect the turmoil within the Usher family. The walls, the floors, and the air itself seemed to be alive with an oppressive force. I soon became aware of strange sounds, such as the faint, ghostly echoes of footsteps and cries in the distance. These sounds seemed to come from the very heart of the house itself. As the days passed, I became increasingly uneasy. Madeline's condition worsened, and Roderick became more and more agitated. One evening, when I had retired to my room, I was disturbed by the sound of footsteps in the corridor. I opened the door to investigate, only to find that it was Madeline herself who had come from her bed, her ghostly figure moving with eerie grace. She appeared to be walking toward her brother Roderick, who was in an altered state of frenzy. As I followed her into his room, I was struck by the utter strangeness of the scene. Madeline, whose illness had consumed her, now stood before us, dead, yet not dead. She fell into her brother's arms, and together they collapsed into the floor. In that moment, the house seemed to tremble, and the walls cracked, as if the very foundation of the building could no longer support the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. The entire house, consumed by the fate of the Usher family, began to collapse around us. The walls fell away, the floors caved in, and the house was swallowed by the earth itself. As I fled from the crumbling house, I turned to look back, and the entire mansion sank into the ground, disappearing into the depths of the earth, leaving only the darkness and the ruin behind. The lottery. The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with the fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were in full bloom, and the grass was rich with dew. In the town square, the people began to gather for the annual lottery. The town had a population of about 300, and this year's lottery was just like all the others before it. The lottery was conducted by Mr. Summers, a jovial man who conducted the drawing each year. He was accompanied by a man named Mr. Graves, the postmaster, who helped him in preparing the slips of paper that would be drawn. The children of the town had gathered earlier in the morning to collect stones, their youthful energy and excitement adding an odd contrast to the grim ritual that would soon unfold. As the townsfolk assembled, they exchanged small talk and laughter, going about their business in a seemingly ordinary manner. They all knew the rules of the lottery, and they all participated without question, as they had for generations. The tradition of the lottery had become so ingrained in their society that it was considered normal, unquestionable. When the crowd had gathered, Mr. Summers called everyone to attention. He produced a black box, old and weathered, which had been used for generations. The box was placed on a table in the middle of the square. Mr. Summers asked for the head of each household to come forward, one by one, and draw a slip of paper from the box. The slip of paper was folded and kept secret until all had drawn. Tessie Hutchinson, who had arrived late to the lottery, laughed nervously as she hurried to join her husband, Bill, who had already drawn his slip. He showed her the paper he had drawn. It was blank. The other townspeople also drew slips, each nervously waiting for their turn to see if they would be the one chosen. When the drawing was complete, it was time to reveal the slips of paper. Mr. Summers called for everyone to open their papers. Tessie Hutchinson was the last to open her slip, and when she did, her face fell in horror. She had drawn the slip with a black dot. A gasp ran through the crowd as the realization sank in. Tessie had been selected as the winner of the lottery, and the crowd now turned to the next part of the ritual. The townspeople, who had just moments before exchanged pleasantries and smiles, now turned cold and distant. They began to gather around Tessie, and the youngest children, who had been so full of energy earlier, now stood quietly, holding stones in their hands. Tessie protested, shouting that the lottery was not fair, that it was unjust, but her cries were ignored. The townspeople, including her own family members, continued to gather stones, preparing to carry out the cruel fate that had been decided by the lottery. In the final, shocking moment, the townspeople closed in on Tessie, and she was stoned to death by the very people who had once been her neighbors and friends. Her screams echoed in the square, but they were drowned out by the sound of the stones hitting her body. The lottery, a tradition that had been followed unquestioningly for Generations had claimed its victim once again. Here's the full text of The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores, with dissolution, the scarlet stains upon the body and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men, and the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers, and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress nor egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first, let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. These were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect to the right and left. In the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The 7th apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro, or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers, but in the corridors that followed the suite, there stood opposite to each window a heavy tripod, bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illumined the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered, that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. Here is the full text of The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe. The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as I best could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. You, who so well know the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. At length I would be avenged. This was a point definitively settled, but the very definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is unredressed when retribution overtakes its redresser. It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. It must be understood that neither by word nor deed had I given Fortunato cause to doubt my goodwill. I continued, as was my wont, to smile in his face, and he did not perceive that my smile now was at the thought of his immolation. He had a weak point, this Fortunato. Although in other regards he was a man to be respected and even feared, he prided himself on his connoisseurship in wine. Few Italians have the true virtuoso spirit. For the most part, their enthusiasm is adopted to suit the time and opportunity, to practice imposture upon the British and Austrian millionaires. In painting and gemmery, Fortunato, like his countrymen, was a quack. But in the matter of old wines, he was sincere. In this respect, I did not differ from him materially. I was skillful in the Italian vintages myself, and bought largely whenever I could. It was about dusk, one evening during the supreme madness of the carnival season, that I encountered my friend. He accosted me with excessive warmth, for he had been drinking much. The man wore motley. He had on a tight-fitting party-striped dress, and his head was surmounted by the conical cap and bells. I was so pleased to see him that I thought I should never have done wringing his hand. I said to him, "My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. How remarkably well you are looking today. But I have received a pipe of what passes for Amontillado, and I have my doubts." "How?" said he. "Amontillado? A pipe? Impossible. And in the middle of the carnival." "I have my doubts," I replied, "and I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price without consulting you in the matter. You were not to be found, and I was fearful of losing a bargain. Amontillado. I have my doubts. Amontillado. And I must satisfy them. Amontillado. As you are engaged, I am on my way to Lucchesi. If anyone has a critical turn, it is he. He will tell me Lucchesi cannot tell Amontillado from sherry, and yet some fools will have it that his taste is a match for your own. Come, let us go." "Whither?" "To your vaults." "My friend, no. I will not impose upon your good nature. I perceive you have an engagement." "Lucchesi, I have no engagement. Come." "My friend, no. It is not the engagement, but the severe cold with which I perceive you are afflicted. The vaults are insufferably damp. They are encrusted with nitre. Let us go, nevertheless. The cold is merely nothing. Amontillado. You have been imposed upon, and as for Lucrezi, he cannot distinguish sherry from amontillado. Shall I continue? This thrilling tale of betrayal and vengeance will only grow darker. Let me know. Edgar Allan Poe, The Pit and the Pendulum. Edgar Allan Poe, I was sick unto death with that long agony. And when they at length unbound me, and I was permitted to sit, I felt that my senses were leaving me. The sentence, the dread sentence, of death was the last distinct accentuation which reached my ears. After that, the sound of the inquisitorial voices seemed merged in one dreamy, indeterminate hum. It conveyed to my soul the idea of revolution, perhaps from its association, in fancy, with the burr of a mill wheel. This only for a brief period, for presently I heard no more, yet for a while I saw, but without terrible an exaggeration, I saw the lips of the black-robed judges. They appeared to me white, whiter than the sheet upon which I traced these words, and thin even to grotesqueness, thin with the intensity of their expression of firmness, of immovable resolution, of stern contempt of human torture. I saw that the decrees of what to me was fate were still issuing from those lips. I saw them writhe with a deadly locution. I saw them fashion the syllables of my name, and I shuddered because no sound succeeded. I saw, too, for a few moments of delirious horror, the soft and nearly imperceptible waving of the sable draperies which enwrapped the walls of the apartment, and then my vision fell upon the 7 tall candles upon the table. At first, they wore the aspect of charity, and seemed white, slender angels who would save me. But then, all at once, there came a most deadly nausea over my spirit, and I felt every fiber in my frame thrill as if I had touched the wire of a galvanic battery, while the angel forms became meaningless specters with heads of flame, and I saw that from them there would be no help. And then there stole into my fancy, like a rich musical note, the thought of what sweet rest there must be in the grave. The thought came gently and stealthily, and it seemed long before it attained full appreciation. But just as my spirit came, at length, properly to feel and entertain it, the figures of the judges vanished as if magically from before me. The tall candles sank into nothingness. Their flames went out utterly. The blackness of darkness supervened. All sensations appeared swallowed up in a mad rushing descent, as of the soul into Hades. Then silence and stillness and night were the universe. I had swooned, but still will not say that all of consciousness was lost. What of it there remained, I will not attempt to define or even to describe. Yet all was not lost. In the deepest slumber, no. In delirium, no. In a swoon, no. In death, no. Even in the grave all is not lost. Else there is no immortality for man. Arousing from the most profound of slumbers, we break the gossamer web of some dream. Yet, in a second afterward, so frail may that web have been, we remember not that we have dreamed. In the return to life from the swoon, there are 2 stages. First, that of the sense of mental or spiritual. Secondly, that of the sense of physical existence. It seems probable that if, upon reaching the second stage, we could recall the impressions of the first, we should find these impressions eloquent in memories of the gulf beyond. And that gulf is what? How at least shall we distinguish its shadows from those of the tomb? But if the impressions of what I have termed the first stage are not, at will, recalled, yet, after long interval, do they not come unbidden, while we marvel whence they come? He who has never swooned is not he who finds strange palaces and wildly familiar faces in coals that glow. Is not he who beholds floating in mid-air the sad visions that the many may not view. Is not he who ponders over the perfume of some novel flower. Is not he whose brain grows bewildered with the meaning of some musical cadence which has never before arrested his attention. Amid frequent and thoughtful endeavors to remember, amid earnest struggles to regather some token of the state of seeming nothingness into which my soul had lapsed, there have been moments when I have dreamed of success. There have been brief, very brief periods when I have conjured up remembrances which the lucid reason of a later epoch assures me could have had reference only to that condition of seeming unconsciousness. These shadows of memory tell indistinctly of tall figures that lifted and bore me in silence down, down, still down, till a hideous dizziness oppressed me at the mere idea of the interminableness of the descent. Shall I continue? This suspenseful story grows darker and more vivid. The haunting of Hill House. Eleanor's isolation is a key theme. She feels estranged from the world and longs for connection, which she finds, however tenuously, in Hill House. Her desire for acceptance leads her to emotionally invest in the house, which ultimately consumes her. One of the most compelling aspects of the haunting of Hill House is its ambiguity. Are the strange occurrences in the house truly supernatural, or is Eleanor's mind unraveling? The novel plays with the idea that fear can be psychological, and that mental and emotional trauma can lead to perceptions of the supernatural. The house itself seems to be a character in the novel, embodying a form of malevolent energy. Hill House is described as being alive in a way. With its bizarre architecture and oppressive atmosphere, the novel suggests that evil can inhabit spaces and influence people, creating a sense of horror that's beyond individual control. Much of the horror in the haunting of Hill House arises from the unknown. The characters' fears are based not just on tangible events but also on their own uncertainties. The house's power lies in its ability to evoke this fear of what cannot be seen or understood, creating psychological terror that feels all-encompassing. Eleanor's struggle to find her place in the world is mirrored in her experience with the house. As she becomes more connected to Hill House, she begins to lose a sense of herself, symbolizing how deeply personal trauma can shape identity. The house draws out her deepest insecurities, leading to a tragic end. The haunting of Hill House is an unsettling exploration of fear, identity, and the supernatural. Shirley Jackson's mastery of psychological horror creates a tense atmosphere where the boundary between the real and the imagined becomes increasingly difficult to discern. The novel is both a supernatural thriller and a deep psychological study of human emotions and vulnerabilities. The story of The Haunting of Hill House is a gothic horror novel that explores the psychological and supernatural tensions within a group of individuals staying in a mansion with a sinister reputation. It begins with Dr. John Montague, an investigator of the supernatural, who rents the infamous Hill House for his research. He invites several people with a history of unusual experiences with the supernatural to stay in the house with him. Among the group are Eleanor Vance, a shy, reclusive woman who has spent most of her life caring for her ailing mother, and Theodora, an enigmatic artist who has been accused of being a lesbian, though she denies it. As the story progresses, it becomes clear that Hill House is no ordinary mansion. The house itself seems to have a malevolent force, influencing the characters in strange and disturbing ways. Eleanor, in particular, becomes deeply affected by the house and the events that unfold within it. She begins to feel as though the house is calling to her, and she experiences strange visions and feelings of being watched. The house's architecture is unnerving, with twisted corridors, doors that open and close by themselves, and rooms that seem to be alive with energy. Throughout the novel, it is unclear whether the supernatural events are truly happening, or if they are a manifestation of the character's own psychological states. Eleanor's emotional vulnerability and sense of isolation make her an ideal target for the house's influence. As the story reaches its climax, the lines between reality and madness blur, and Eleanor is forced to confront her own feelings of guilt, loneliness, and desire for belonging. Carrie by Stephen King. Carrie is Stephen King's first published novel, and it tells the story of a shy, socially awkward high school girl named Carrie White, who discovers that she possesses telekinetic powers. The novel is a blend of psychological, horror, and supernatural suspense, with themes of bullying, revenge, and the effects of a toxic, oppressive upbringing. The story is told through a series of flashbacks, newspaper clippings, and interviews, which piece together the events leading up to the tragic and violent climax. Plot summary. Carrie White is an outcast at her high school in a small town in Maine. She lives with her abusive, fanatically religious mother, Margaret White, who subjects her to cruel punishments and teaches her that her sinful nature will lead to her eventual damnation. Carrie is constantly bullied by her classmates, particularly by a group of girls led by Chris Hargensen, who regularly torment her at school. Carrie's life takes a dramatic turn during her senior year, when she begins to develop strange powers after being humiliated by her classmates during gym class, where she gets her first period and is ridiculed by her peers. She experiences a violent outburst that causes objects around her to move without her touching them. This is the first indication that Carrie possesses telekinetic abilities. She can move and manipulate objects with her mind. At the same time, she meets Sue Snell, one of the popular girls who feels guilty about bullying Carrie, and decides to make amends by encouraging her boyfriend, Tommy Ross, to invite Carrie to the school prom. Carrie, who has always felt like an outsider, is thrilled by the prospect of being accepted and finally having a chance to be part of the social fabric of the school. However, her hopes are shattered when Chris Hargensen, still angry over being banned from prom for her previous behavior, conspires to humiliate Carrie at the dance. Chris and her boyfriend, Billy Nolan, rig the prom's royalty crown ceremony so that Carrie, who has been crowned prom queen, is drenched in pig's blood in front of the entire school. This public humiliation is the breaking point for Carrie. Overcome with rage, Carrie uses her telekinetic powers to exact a terrible revenge on her tormentors. She causes the gym to catch fire, trapping everyone inside, and uses her abilities to kill many of her classmates and teachers, including Chris and Billy. The ensuing chaos results in widespread destruction, and Carrie's telekinetic powers continue to wreak havoc on the town as she heads home. The novel culminates in a final confrontation with her mother, Margaret, who sees Carrie's powers as the work of the devil. Margaret attempts to kill her daughter in a religious frenzy, but Carrie, in a fit of rage, kills her mother and causes the house to collapse around her. Carrie dies shortly after, her powers exhausted. The aftermath of the prom massacre is explored through various sources, including news reports and interviews, which depict the lasting impact of the tragedy on the town and the individuals involved. The story ends with the hint that Carrie's legacy may live on, as her powers might be passed on to others. The Shining. The Shining is a psychological horror novel that revolves around Jack Torrance, his wife Wendy, and their young son Danny as they move into the isolated Overlook Hotel for the winter. Set in the remote Colorado mountains, the hotel is closed off from the outside world during the cold season, making it the perfect job for Jack, a struggling writer and recovering alcoholic, to take as a caretaker. Little do they know, the hotel has a sinister and malevolent presence that will bring their darkest fears to life. Jack Torrance has been given a final chance to redeem himself and provide for his family by taking a job as the winter caretaker of the Overlook Hotel. He is an alcoholic who has recently ruined his career and relationship with his family due to his drinking problem and violent tendencies. His wife, Wendy, and young son, Danny, accompany him to the hotel. Danny Torrance is not an ordinary child. He has a psychic ability called the Shining, which allows him to see visions and read minds. He is aware that the Overlook Hotel holds dark secrets and has been a site of past violence and tragedy. Danny also has the ability to communicate telepathically with the hotel's cook, Dick Halloran, who shares the same psychic abilities. As the winter deepens, the hotel's eerie influence begins to take hold of Jack. He is gradually driven insane by the malevolent force of the hotel, which preys on his vulnerabilities, his alcoholism, his abusive tendencies, and his feelings of failure. The hotel seems to have a mind of its own, and it uses Jack's weaknesses to manipulate him into becoming a threat to his own family. Danny, with his psychic abilities, begins to experience terrifying visions and encounters with the ghosts of the hotel. He is the only one who can see the true nature of the hotel's horrors. Wendy, concerned for her family's safety, begins to fear that Jack is losing his sanity. But it's not just Jack she has to worry about. There are also supernatural forces at play. As Jack becomes consumed by the hotel's power, he succumbs to its influence and turns violent. The story culminates in a terrifying battle for survival, as Danny and Wendy must confront the evil that lurks within the Overlook Hotel and try to escape before it consumes them all. Pet Cemetery. Pet Cemetery is a psychological horror novel that deals with grief, the consequences of defying natural laws, and the haunting effects of loss. The story centers around Louis Creed, a doctor who moves with his family to a rural town in Maine, where he becomes involved with a cemetery that has the disturbing ability to bring dead animals and people back to life, but at a cost. Louis Creed, a doctor from Chicago, relocates with his wife Rachel, their 2 young children, Ellie and Gage, to a small house in the rural town of Ludlow, Maine. Their new home is situated near a pet cemetery, where local children bury their deceased animals. The cemetery is a peaceful, sad place, where many of the town's pets are buried, but it harbors a much darker secret. Soon after moving in, Louis befriends his elderly neighbor, Judd Crandall, who shares with him the terrifying secret of the nearby burial ground. Judd reveals that the pet cemetery is not just an ordinary graveyard. It has the power to bring things back to life, but those resurrected are never quite the same. Judd explains that, as a child, he and his brother had buried their dog in the pet cemetery, and it returned from the dead with a malevolent, unnatural presence. The animals buried there are returned to life, but they are different, more feral and hostile. Despite this warning, tragedy strikes the Creed family when their beloved cat, Church, is killed in an accident. Louis, devastated by the loss of the cat, decides to take Church to the mysterious burial ground. He buries the cat in the pet cemetery, and to his astonishment, Church returns from the dead. However, Church's behavior is erratic and sinister, and Louis soon realizes that the return of the dead is not a miracle, but a curse. Tragedy strikes again when Louis's young son, Gage, is killed in a car accident on the highway near their home. Overcome with grief and desperate to reverse the loss, Louis decides to use the same burial ground to bring his son back to life. Despite the warnings from Judd and the horrifying consequences of tampering with death, Louis buries Gage in the pet cemetery, and the child returns. But he is no longer the sweet boy he once was. The resurrected Gage is a violent, malevolent force, and his actions are horrific and unnatural. In the end, Louis is forced to confront the devastating consequences of his actions, leading to a tragic and dark conclusion. American Psycho is a satirical novel that follows the life of Patrick Bateman, a wealthy and successful investment banker in 1980s Manhattan, who leads a double life as a brutal serial killer. The novel explores themes of superficiality, materialism, and the disintegration of moral and emotional boundaries in a society obsessed with wealth and status. The story is narrated by Patrick Bateman, a 27-year-old vice president at a Wall Street investment firm, where he spends his days analyzing financial markets and his nights indulging in violent, sadistic fantasies. Bateman leads a life of excess, filled with high-end restaurants, expensive brands, drugs, and a shallow social circle. His colleagues, friends, and acquaintances are often interchangeable, and they seem equally obsessed with status symbols, appearances, and wealth. Bateman's outward persona is that of a successful and charming businessman, but underneath the facade, he is a deeply disturbed individual. He frequently indulges in acts of extreme violence, including murdering and torturing people, often without any clear motive other than the thrill of inflicting pain. His victims include both strangers and people he interacts with on a regular basis, and his actions are characterized by their brutality, randomness, and complete lack of empathy. As the narrative unfolds, Bateman's grip on reality begins to unravel. He struggles to distinguish between what is real and what is a product of his increasingly deranged mind. He becomes more paranoid, believing that others are onto his murderous behavior, yet he is never caught or held accountable for his actions. The novel leaves the reader questioning whether Bateman's violence is real or merely a figment of his imagination, as his life continues to spiral out of control. Throughout the book, Bateman's interactions with other characters, his fiancée, his colleagues, and various people he encounters in his daily life, are often shallow and devoid of meaningful connections. He has a complex relationship with his fiancée, Evelyn, whom he constantly lies to and manipulates, but he seems detached from any genuine emotional attachment to her. The people around him, including his friends, are equally obsessed with their superficial lives, often engaging in meaningless conversations and seeking validation through material possessions and appearances. The novel's climax is ambiguous, as Bateman's actions become increasingly erratic, and the line between reality and illusion blurs. In the final chapters, Bateman confesses his crimes in a frantic rant, but his confession is dismissed as a joke by his lawyer, who seems indifferent to the atrocities he describes. The novel ends with a sense of unresolved tension, leaving readers to question the truth of Bateman's narrative and whether his violent acts were ever real. The murders in the Rue Morgue. During the summer of the year 18, when the days were long and warm, a friend of mine, Monsieur C. Auguste Dupin, with whom I had been on intimate terms for many years, invited me to visit him at his residence in Paris. Dupin was an eccentric, reclusive gentleman, a man of great intellectual prowess, who had an insatiable curiosity for the obscure and mysterious. It was this fascination that led us, on the fateful morning of our meeting, to an event of tremendous intrigue and terror. The story that follows begins with a most unusual murder case. Two women, Madame L'Espanaye and her daughter Camille, had been brutally murdered in their apartment on the Rue Morgue. The crime was so horrific, so inexplicable, that the Parisian police were baffled. The details of the crime were as follows. The victims were found in their apartment under strange and terrifying circumstances. Madame L'Espanaye's body was discovered in the courtyard below, horribly mutilated, with her throat cut and her head nearly severed from her body. Her daughter, Camille, was found in an even more grotesque state. Her body was thrown into a chimney, her neck broken, and her face so disfigured that it was nearly unrecognizable. The apartment was in disarray, and the police found no clear motive for the crime, nor any trace of the killer. I had heard of the case, and as soon as Dupin learned of the murders, he became immediately interested. He decided to investigate, and I accompanied him, eager to see his sharp mind at work. Dupin's analytical skills were unparalleled, and I knew that if anyone could solve the mystery, it would be him. When we arrived at the Rue Morgue, Dupin immediately began his investigation. He examined the scene of the crime with meticulous attention to detail. He noted the strange sounds that had been heard by witnesses, screams that seemed to come from both a woman and a man. This was unusual because the two victims were alone in the apartment. Dupin also observed the broken windows and the strange, unidentifiable foreign language that the witnesses claimed to have heard. From these initial observations, Dupin formulated a theory. He hypothesized that the murder was not committed by a human, but by an animal, a large, wild, and ferocious orangutan. Dupin believed that the beast had somehow escaped from its owner and had gone on a rampage in the apartment. The language that had been heard was, in fact, the animal's cries, and the mutilation of the victims was the result of the orangutan's uncontrollable rage. Dupin then took us to the residence of the orangutan's owner, a foreigner named Sailor. Sailor had been missing for several days, and Dupin believed that he had been searching for his escaped pet. Eventually, Dupin managed to track down the orangutan, who had been captured and brought back to the police station. The creature's violent behavior had been responsible for the deaths of Madame L'Espanaye and her daughter. Dupin's keen intellect and deductive reasoning had unraveled the mystery, and the case was solved. The police, who had been unable to find any clues, were astonished by Dupin's methods. He had solved the crime with his remarkable powers of observation and analysis. The resolution of the case left me in awe of Dupin's genius, and I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration for his brilliant mind. He had solved the most perplexing mystery with a calm and collected demeanor, and in doing so, he had once again demonstrated his superiority over the average detective. This case marked the beginning of Dupin's career as a detective, and it, too, was only the first of many mysteries that he would unravel. It also established him as one of the most famous and skilled detectives of his time, earning him a reputation that would last for generations to come.